How deep was the rot in Mitzrayim before the Jewish people left? And how deep do we have to dig within ourselves in order to leave our personal Mitzrayim? Let's see the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and what that tells us about how much we had to rehabilitate Mitzrayim. The Rebbe will also link this to the laws of what it takes to get rid of Chometz. So we know that with regards to the makas that happened in Mitzrayim, we know this from the Pesach Seder, is da prukta zwischen Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. There's a debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer, Omer kol makkah hoisa shel arba makkah ischule. According to Rabbi Eliezer, every one of the 10 plagues was actually made up of 4 plagues within it. Whereas Rabbi Akiva, Omer shel chamesh makkah ischule. Rabbi Akiva says each plague was made out of 5 elements, of 5 divisions, 5 facets, 5 plagues. Okay, what's the difference? What is the message behind these 2 opinions, whether it was 4 or 5 plagues? Is Voeira Kolboy b'shem Abal HaMelamed. The Kolboy quotes the so-called teacher as the plukta is that the argument is as follows: it's deep spiritual stuff. Rabbi Eliezer halt, als nachher haben durchgenommen alle Dalige Seides von jeder Sach, in welches sie seien gewähnt die Makkos. According to Rabbi Eliezer, each one of the Makkos infected and affected all the 4 core elements that made up every single thing that they touched. We'll see an example in a second. Das heißt, the Makkah is given nicht nur in der Sach, wie sie schein am Morgen von alle Furious Seides. That means the Makkah didn't just strike the particular thing as a finished product where all the various components and elements were already put together. No, sie hat the Greich noch tiefer, but it actually drilled down into a far deeper reality of each element. Eichen dem Etzem von jeden Yesoid, to the essence of each element that made up the particular thing. Was in der Sach und der Rebbe is jeden Makkah Shalab. That's why each Makkah was 4-faceted. Let's give an example, because this could be quite abstract. Oder Dogma. Mit der Makkah's Dam ist geschlagen geworden nicht nur die Wasser, wie das setzt sich als Nutzis von Maim. When the water was smitten and turned into blood, it wasn't just that the water turned into blood, the finished product, water as we know it, turned into blood. But the other invisible elements that make up water, so the fire element, which might be the energy within water or the potential to boil, and the earth element, which is the tangibility of water, and the air element, of course, the oxygen particles within the water, all of those turn into blood as well, not just the overarching element of water. Rabbi Akiva takes it even deeper. Rabbi Akiva tut auf noch mehr. As in Maki Zoich in dem Chomer Hiyuli fun der Sach, Rabbi Akiva says that there's this principle of called Chomer Hiyuli, which is primeval material. In other words, the basic material before it's even identified as 4 elements. The Makkah got to that depth as well. It's almost like the subatomic reality of the particular item. Was is Boshut Izgitom from the Tzu from the Dalit Yesodis. That's a level of each particular thing where it doesn't even have the appearance of elements per se. That's why it's like subatomic realities, the quarks, whatever it might be. Therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, there's 5 aspects to every single plague because it dismantles all the 4 visible elements, Eish, Ruach, Maim, Ofar, fire, air, water, and earth, that make up the particular item, as well as that which is invisible, that lies even deeper, maybe the dark matter, whatever it is, that makes up the real essence of what something is. Now, once we know that information, let's take it back to understand, well, what's the purpose of the Makkos? It wasn't just simply to punish the Egyptians. The Mechuben in the Makkos is given Kishmon, simple understanding, as the name indicates, of the Makkos was to Shlogan and to Bracha Mitzrayim, to hit and to break Egypt, which means not just to punish, but to break the Metzius of Egypt. Davon ist verständlich, which leads us to understand, as in all das, was die Makkos haben durchgedrungen in die Dvarim Hamukim. So the fact then that the Makkos, as we now see Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva debate how deeply they went into the particular materials, is alav leid beide deis is das given nicht nur in dem Giloi. So both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva agree that the strike of each Makkah didn't only hit what was visible or tangible to us, to people, to observers. And the Zach wir zetzachon. In other words, the item as it appears is not the only level of the item that was harmed. The water wasn't only, it was the particles of the water as well. Now, the essence of what that thing is made of was also affected by and impacted by the particular makkah. That's by all accounts. But Beis, die Tzveides an Alzidas given euch in dem Chimmer Yulid Adenor in der Chimmer via Hatchen Atzir from the Dalit Yesodis. Now, this debate about how deeply did it go is das Tolle, wie viel Thomas Mitzrayim hat es durchgenommen, all depends on 2 perspectives on how deep did the rot of Mitzrayim go, how deep did the impurity of Mitzrayim infect Mitzrayim. If the purpose of the makkos is to break and dismantle Mitzrayim, then depending on how deeply Mitzrayim is bad will determine how deeply the makkos have to strike. So let's understand that concept, because that will link us to how you get rid of chametz. Chametz, of course, being the symbol of and the evolution of the tumah of Mitzrayim. So der Inyan alalas, tumas Mitzrayim hat gekriegt dem Etzem von Metzias Advarim und die oben gebrachte Plukte in them. So now we've identified that everybody agrees that the impurity of Mitzrayim went beneath the surface, and it's just a debate of how deeply beneath the surface. Spiegelt sich ab wie alle Inyani hagodim primis haTorah in nigle de Torah. Like anything else which is in the more esoteric or the more intangible parts of Torah, it will always reflect back to the very tangible, the legalistic parts of Torah. Bizan halacha. In the Teichen va'ifin is ha'isur chametz, and you're going to see the same principles that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar debate are going to reflect in the debate about how you get rid of chametz. Versus hamasuba from tumas Mitzrayim. Chametz is effectively an outcome of the impurity of Mitzrayim. It's like the residue of the impurity of Mitzrayim. That's why we have to get rid of it over Pesach. So the Issa chametz is nitna ba'achila uvahano. What's unique about chametz is not only that you're forbidden to eat chametz, because that would be like other tray foods, and not only that, you're not even allowed to have personal benefit from chametz, which is not unique to chametz. Other categories of Isser that also you may not have benefit from. What's radical about chametz is naroich b'bal yiro bal yemotze. You may not see it, and it may not be anywhere in your possession. On brengt the mechiv mitzvah from bir chametz, which obviously then brings us to the responsibility that we have to get rid of chametz. Because it's not just a matter of not using it, you're not allowed to have it. Now, the shaychus von achira b'yisurim mit davar anechal is mitzayin tzura. If you think about it, when we're told that we may not eat something, obviously that is a restriction against us engaging what that particular thing has to offer in its appearance, in its current state. So in other words, if you tell me not to eat something, you're obviously referring to something that is in a state that could be eaten. In other words, it's like a finished product. It's ready for the market. If the prohibition is against eating, then we're not talking so much about the material as we are about the product. So for example, if you have a raw potato, then you don't have to tell me not to eat it, because I wouldn't eat it. But if I have a potato that's been roasted, so now it's ready to eat, it's got the tzura, it's got the appearance of a food product that's ready to eat, and now the Torah comes along and says, for whatever reason, I may not eat it, so there would be a restriction against me engaging with this particular item in its finished state, but there wouldn't be a prohibition against the thing in its raw state. So we're not prohibiting the actual essence of what this particular thing is. Whereas but when you tell me that I'm not allowed to have benefit from an item, then you're telling me the entire item, not just its current presentation, is problematic. So if theoretically you told me that I may not have any benefit from a potato, that means I can't throw the potato to an animal to eat, or I can't turn it into mulch to fertilize my garden, or whatever the case is, because there's something intrinsically wrong with this potato, not just with the edible potato. But das eine von die Biurim, wie kann sein als Sach, so sein ist als Bachil und Mutterbein. And that helps us to understand how you could have something which the Torah says you're allowed to have and even benefit from, you just may not eat it. Because from a spiritual perspective, if something is bad and if something is prohibited, surely I should be completely hands off. So how can I have any personal benefit from it? It's something impure, it's something dirty. Not the beer in them is canal, but that's exactly the point. If the Torah says that the limitation and the restriction around something is I may not eat it, the Torah is effectively telling us that the impurity of that particular item is relatively superficial. It's only manifest in the current presentation or in the user-friendly element of this particular thing. So in the state that it is ready to eat, that's the state that is infected and can't be touched. But a deeper state, the raw state, where it's not relevant to humans, for example, might not be impure. On the Rebbe is this mutbar nov, and then because then it's possible that I could have a personal benefit, I could sell it, or I could use it for another purpose, because the essence of this particular item has not been infected. That's the difference between something which is forbidden to eat versus something which is forbidden for personal benefit. So now that we've established that when something is forbidden to have any benefit, that indicates that the impurity has seeped all the way into the essence of the actual item itself. Still, it's not completely to the essence of it. Think about it. If I'm not allowed to have benefit from something, then the restriction is still where it benefits, where it adds value to my life. Something can only add value to my life if it has a particular presentation. So, for example, if I have a whole lot of subatomic particles, it's not going to give any benefit to my life. Whereas when I have an item that I may not eat, but I am allowed to sell, well, it still plays a role in my life because it's got a market value and it's got a particular shape and a particular appearance, etc. So that means that we're still talking about something which is somewhat superficial. You're not yet at the core of what it is. It's something which can be identified. Chometz is different. Chometz aber kommt zu der Iser as a tozich nit gefinnen in Rishus von Aiden. What's unique about Chometz is I may not have it anywhere in my possession. Afilu on welches is shimush mitten Chometz, even if I'm never going to touch it. I'm not going to use it, even indirectly. Das heißt, dass der Isa hat durchgenommen dem Chemewetzem Adavar, wie es ausgetan von Eise Zura Shatiyeh. That is evidence to the fact that the impurity associated with Chometz on Pesach is something that has touched the very essence of the Chometz items, regardless of their utility. Was der Fall ist, der Yemotze, der Etzem Veranenkeit von dem Chometz in seiner Schuss also. That's why the problem is not eating, the problem is not even using or benefiting from, the problem is if it exists, because its mere existence is absolutely fundamentally impure. And that's pretty much how Mitzrayim was. Its existence had to be dismantled because it's fundamentally impure. Now, in the mitzvah, let's analyze this mitzvah of getting rid of chometz. You'll see that there's a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, and that's going to speak to this point. Because in the mitzvah from Bir Chometz is the aprukta between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. The Mishnah Pesachim brings the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, which is Rabbi Yehuda Eimer ein Bir Chometz ela sreifa. Rabbi Yehuda says there's only one way to get rid of chometz, and that's to burn it. Whereas the Chachamim say the other ways. You could dissolve it, crumble it up, and let the wind blow it away, or you could throw it into the sea, and that would also be acceptable. So the Rogachov explains what's the rationale between the two views. Rabbi Yehuda is very clear about the fact that the chometz has to disappear. It has to be in a state where there's no longer chometz, absolutely destroyed. So you got to burn it. Because if you just scatter it to the wind or throw it into the water, the fact is the chometz will still exist, just in microscopic particles, but it will still exist. Whereas the Chachamim say, well, as long as it no longer appears like chometz in the normal way that chometz is, that's good enough. That would be considered destruction. The minute you destroy the chometz from its current state, it is no longer something a person would eat or be able to have benefit from, and that's good enough. And you can achieve that by scattering it to the wind or throwing it into a body of water. Or move on. So it's self-understood. As das Gufa, der Shir von Hashbasa, is toloi, a wieviel diese chometz nem durch den Dvaris. So clearly the nature of this debate of what does it take to destroy chometz must be directly related to how deeply is chometz infected by impurity. If we understand that the nature of chometz is that it has been contaminated all the way to the core of its being, then and then the only way to get rid of chometz is that the essence of its being no longer exists. You have to burn it. And if you're going to argue that yes, there's a deep contamination in chometz, but it's only to the chometz that can be described and identified as chometz, then is genug to mashbe sein yitzur def shos fachila bano. Well, then all you need to do is neutralize it from being something that is susceptible, that is usable, that you could eat, that you could have benefit from. Or you don't have to destroy it at its core. Well, the name is nitokenisa because there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it at the core of its being. And with that in mind, we could then align Rabbi Yehuda with Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim with Rabbi Eliezer. We'll align it directly to the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about how many layers were there to each makkah. Rabbi Eliezer was Rabbi Eliezer, who, as we've mentioned, said that each makkah was made up of 4 components. So his view is that the Makkos only had to attack Mitzrayim as a visible Mitzrayim, as a Mitzrayim that identifies as Mitzrayim, that looks, walks, quacks like Mitzrayim. That's Keshitas Chachamim, so that aligns with the opinion of the Chachamim. Chometz the same. You just need to get rid of its appearance, of its structure. As man darf nur beweis sein, der Metzius von dem Chometz, wer ist verbunden mit Teuer von Chometz, der Schor ist Fachil Vano, as the Chachamim say, as long as you get rid of the Chometz that could be used, that could be eaten, you get rid of its appearance, you get rid of its structure, you get rid of its of its reality, that's good enough. Und das Rabbi Akiva, weil gesagt, das Kol Macha Chudosh of Chomesh Makos, whereas Rabbi Akiva says, no, you've got to dig deeper, you've got to get to that invisible core of Mitzrayim and destroy that too. Because you've also got to dismantle the primeval subatomic reality of this particular thing called Mitzrayim. Is das Fall halt Geschichte Rabbi Yehuda. So he would align completely with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that the only way to get rid of Chometz is destroy completely, that it no longer resembles Chometz in any way at all. So, bedugme, so die zwei Fanim bir Chometz, when you get after Metzius for Chometz. Now that we have these two views about getting rid of Chometz, and that it's a question of, do you have to just get rid of Chometz in the class of Chometz, or do you have to get rid of Chometz in the essence of Chometz? So, Torah hat geasset die etzem Metzius, wie sie ist ausgetan von welcher es ist Zura, is the Torah prohibiting us from having any association with any variable of Chometz, even when it doesn't appear as classic Chometz? Or is the Torah only restricting us from engaging with Chometz when it appears as Chometz, when it has the structural integrity of Chometz? Das was die Sache ist, the fact that there's the potential that you may get some kind of a benefit out of it. So because there are two views, when the Torah tells us that you may not have benefit from Chometz, there's two possibilities there too. Which of course will link back to our same original point, which is how deeply does the infection go? How bad is the contamination? How much of the core of the chometz is actually affected? So, halacha defines the possibility that there are certain kinds of benefit that a person has, which could eventually track back and link to food. In other words, because the Rashi tells us, basically commenting on the Gemara B'nei Pesachim, that typically what happens is any money trail, so if I have any personal benefit because I sell the chometz or because I give it to somebody as a gift or whatever, there's always the possibility that that's going to lead to me having the resources to be able to buy food. So the prohibition against benefiting from chometz is actually, in a roundabout way, linked to the prohibition against eating the food. Which basically refers to anything that I get personal benefit out of, because you could always translate that into some kind of food, right? I did you a favor, give me a meal or whatever. There's always the possibility to link it back to eating. Of a mele is as maybe lidei, therefore the definition of hana is hana that could potentially eventually lead to being able to eat something. Chelek bedamin v'maychel, again quoting Rashi, because you use the money or the benefit in order to get food. That's one possibility, and it's probably the most common way that we understand hana. But there is another possibility. It is also possible that a person could use something where the fact is you have used it, but it gives you absolutely no benefit. And the classic example that Yerushalmi brings is that what happens if there are some street dogs that don't belong to anybody and you give your chometz to those dogs? So you have no benefit because the dogs are not going to thank you. Neither is the owner going to thank you. And of course, there's no money coming back. So it's a completely humanitarian, or shall we say, altruistic move, and you're getting nothing for it. And you certainly can't say, well, somehow from that act, you're going to land up getting food. And that's the problem, association of chometz becoming food. So Yerushalmi is the kalbe hefker. So the Yerushalmi brings a debate about this. What's the halacha in this particular case? Ein mando mahalt says mutter. One view is it's fine, no problem, because you're not getting any utility. You can feed your chometz to some street dogs that don't belong to anybody. Und der zweite Mann hat das die Pasuk von der Yochel Chometz is marbe, aset euch die Stammschuss von Michael sein dem Chometz kalbe hefker. Whereas the other opinion says, now hang on a second, the Torah says lo yei ochel, which is an unusual expression, it's a more kind of reflective expression, and that indicates it may not come to be eaten through you, even if the recipient is not a human, and not a human that an animal that has no association with any human, so there's no track back for you. Kann man sagen, als die Produkt ist verbunden mit der Scheile, wie viel ist diese Chometz verbunden mit Chemevets and Adaber. So that debate in Yerushalmi will also line up with the debate we've now identified with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, this essential debate about how badly affected is Chometz by the impurity that the Torah needs us to avoid on Pesach. If we're going to go with the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer or the Chachamim, which is that the chometz only really affects what can be described and experienced and defined about the chometz, Dan is this no, was verbunden mit netzem adav kenal mugbal. Well, then the prohibition that the Torah will make against me having any benefit from this chametz will have a limitation. It would have to be a behavior that could link up afterwards with eating. In other words, it could link up with a particular utility, with a particular concept, with a particular experience. Maybe the deisha machila, and only that would be aser. But if you go with Rabbi Akiva's opinion, which appears to be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion as well, that's not good enough, because as long as the chametz just merely exists, that's a problem, because the contamination is right to the core of the chametz. Regardless of whether it looks like chametz, whether it's playing the role of chametz, whether it is edible like chametz, whether it can be sold like chametz. Well, then you're saying that it's an intrinsic prohibition regardless of how you're using it. So if the recipient has no benefit to you, doesn't make a difference. You may not use this chametz in any which way. Even if the result of what you're going to share or who you're going to share the chametz with can never trace back to any personal benefit to you, certainly not eating, doesn't matter. But now we're going to, with that in mind, introduce the third opinion, which is actually included in the Haggadah of Pesach and is brought in the Mechilta, as we'll see in a second. Rabbi Yosef is quoted in the Mechilta just before the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. He says something else, which seems, at first glimpse, to be unrelated to their debate, but turns out is actually directly related. Because Rabbi Yosef Aglili's view is that in Mitzrayim, when it says that there were 10 makos, it means literally 10 makos. But at the sea, that's when it multiplied out to 50. We're not going to focus on the sea, we're going to focus on the fact that he says in Mitzrayim it was only 10 makos. What's his opinion in all of this? Is Valashita is chametz mutar ba'no. That's because Rabbi Yosef Aglili has a view, even though we don't follow this halachically, that you may have personal benefit from chametz as long as you don't eat it. So that would mean that from his perspective, the prohibition against chametz is only chametz when it's playing the ordinary role of chametz, i.e. as a food. Which means Rabbi Yosef Aglili's view of Mitzrayim, because Mitzrayim is the direct cause of chametz, must be that Mitzrayim was only superficially contaminated. Only the structure of Mitzrayim under its then leadership, with its particular hierarchy and treatment of people, that was the problem. And therefore, Rabbi Yosef Aglili's view would be the Mako just has to hit Mitzrayim as we see it, and that suffices. That does the job. So now that we've seen that the argument we built this all on, which is between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, all hinges on how deeply the rot went into the fiber of Mitzrayim. Will help us understand what seems to be a very different topic, and that is, how do you qualify which are the 4 mega nations that persecuted and exiled the Jewish people? Usually Mitzrayim is left out. Typically on the lists in most sources that speak about those nations who gave the Jewish people Golus, gave us a really difficult time. Bavel, Paras, Yavan, Edom. Typically, Mitzrayim is not on the list. And the reason that's usually given is because, as the Arizal says, Mitzrayim is just a mega golus. It's in a whole class of its own, and it's the equivalent to all the other goluyos combined. That's why it's not listed with the others, because it doesn't belong on the same list. It's in a whole different scale of golus. Yet, but there are certain places, including in the Gemara, where Mitzrayim is on the list, and it's actually put as number 1 for obvious chronological reasons, number 1 of the 4 Golios. So which one is it? Is it completely in a category of its own, or is it part of the history of the Jewish people? Well, the reason behind those 2 differences of opinion would link directly back to what is Mitzrayim and how deeply rotten is it. In other words, the Rabbi say, what do we mean? The reason why most of the time Mitzrayim is not listed together with the other great empires that enslaved the Jewish people or imprisoned the Jewish people who exiled the Jewish people, is Val Dalet Malchus V'Golis and Nega Dalet Oisius Havayas, because as the Arizal explains, those four Goliois correspond to the four letters of Hashem's name. They're like the antithesis of Hashem's name. On Golos Mitzrayim is Nega Koitza Shel Yud, whereas Golos Mitzrayim is the little nick, the little piece of the letter Yud that is required in a Sefer Torah in order for the Yud to be a kosher Yud, which isn't really part of the letter and in a sense supersedes the letter. Now, one of the principles that we do know also from that result is that the four elements, fire, air, water, and earth, correspond to the four letters of Hashem's name. Whereas Keser, which is completely beyond the system and is represented by the Koitza Shel Yud, that little piece, the little barb on the Yud, that is something which represents Chomer Hiyuli, the invisible subatomic reality of existence. That implies that the four major Golios each impacted a particular area related to one of the names of Hashem, and Mitzrayim is beyond that because it is able to affect and contaminate, well, not contaminate, but interfere with a very lofty dimension of the Eibusha, which is completely beyond the four letters of Hashem's name. So in those rare occasions where Mitzrayim is on the list of the four, that would have to align with the opinion that Mitzrayim is not the level of Keser, as most opinions put it, but rather the level of Chachma, which is already aligned with and inside the system represented by Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now that opinion would still insist that Mitzrayim is not just the first, but is also the shorish, the root from which every other Golos is spawned. But it's the kind of shorish where it's almost like you can see everything inside it, so to speak, like almost like a miniature version of something that's going to grow, as opposed to a seed, which is more like Chomer Hiyuli. You look at the seed and you cannot see what's going to emerge from the seed. And so therefore that opinion that believes that Mitzrayim is on the list of the four major Golios, that's effectively saying that the Klippa, the impurity of Mitzrayim, could only affect the world in the realm of four Yosodis. It couldn't cause any spiritual damage at a deeper level than the four dimensions of existence, the four basic building blocks of existence, which represent the four letters of Hashem's name. Now, all of that is intriguing to read about Mitzrayim, but it's important to relate back to our lives. The Indian from Golos V'Yitzias Mitzrayim is Eichdoin Avodah Ruchnis. We know very well that the experience of being a slave in Mitzrayim and leaving Mitzrayim is reflected in how we serve the Eibishter. Because Mitzrayim is from Lashain Meitzorim Ugvulim. Anybody familiar with basic Hasidus knows that Mitzrayim is related to the concept of limitations, restrictions, restraints. And obviously escaping Mitzrayim is to escape all of those restrictions. Golos Mitzrayim meint as the Avodah von Aiden is mit Agvul Medida V'Agbola. So to be a slave in Mitzrayim means that we're serving the Eibishter with major limitations defined by the restrictions of Mitzrayim. On Yetzias Mitzrayim is was geht heraus, weil wir das von alle Medidas V'Agbolos, euch mit Agbolos von Nefesh Olikis. To leave Mitzrayim means that you escape. You escape those restrictions, external, internal, even, and this is really interesting, even the limitations of our own Nefesh Olikis. That's what Yetzias Mitzrayim means. Not just to get away from our toxic side, but even to break free of our spiritual status quo, even when it's good spirituality. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are also debating. How far do you have to go in the spiritual move of Yetzias Mitzrayim? They're debating. Is Yetzias Mitzrayim, in other words, the destruction of Mitzrayim, only to dismantle the four core elements of what Mitzrayim is made of? Do you have to go to the very substance of what Mitzrayim is built on? What does that mean spiritually? Was in Ruchnius meint es? Do we only have to challenge ourselves to experience Yetzias Mitzrayim within the realm of the 10 facets and powers of our neshama? The 10 facets of the neshama, as we'll see in just a moment, are split into 4 categories which correspond to the 4 letters of Hashem's name. What are those 4 categories? Aleph, starting from the bottom up. Malchus, the lowest experience of our neshama is what we call Malchus, which relates to behavior and to speech and to even to the way we think. Beyond that is Beis B'midos. Then there's the experience of the neshama as it expresses in our subjective responses to the world, the so-called emotions, zer anpin. Then higher than that, gimel b'seichel bina. Then there's the experience of our neshama intellectually, which relates to bina, and then daled mesiras nefesh chochma. And then the highest level is Mesiras Nefesh, which, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Perikut Ches of Tanya, Mesiras Nefesh is something that comes from Chochma. Not Chochma as in wisdom, Chochma as in the capacity to let go of self, Koyach Ma, to be able to be attached to and committed to something completely beyond ourselves. So that's the opinion, essentially, of Rabbi Eliezer. All of our work has to span from Malchus to Chochma. Or according to Rabbi Akiva, do we also have a challenge to experience Yetzias Mitzrayim at the deepest level of the essence of our neshama, which is the spiritual equivalent of that basic building block of existence? Rabbi Eliezer says just 4 strikes. Rabbi Eliezer gives us plenty work to do, that we should have a Yetzias Mitzrayim experience in all the 4 core aspects of our neshama, from Malchus all the way to Chochmah. So whatever our natural state is in any of those 4 areas, we have to extend it. Now you might ask the question, how do you have a Yetzias Mitzrayim with regards to Mesiras Nefesh? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's start from the bottom. The Nidirik Stoifen is, the simplest, lowest, most accessible level is, we're battling against our Yetzer Hara, and maybe we put in a certain amount of effort, but we do have our limits. Obviously, the intention of the Yetzer Hara is to cause us to fail in those key areas, behavior, speech, or thought. So we're fighting that. And when we need a Yetzias Mitzrayim, is those real challenges in our lives, those particular things. You know how it is. Everybody has something that they think everybody else, if you knew what I was going through, you'd have more sympathy for me, because we all have our particular personal challenges. So that's where you need a Yetzias Mitzrayim in the world of Machshav Dibur Ma'aseh, the world of Malchus. A little bit more subtle and advanced than that. Amer Dakas Dikaifin Mitzrayim is, so it's still Mitzrayim, but it's a totally different kind of Mitzrayim, is as Chacha as Niza B'tachlis von Over Zayin Advar Yisrael. I feel addicted to Kalsha Divrei Seifrim. A person's behavior is beautiful. They are cautious. They stay away from anything that is prohibited, even if it's only rabbinic, even if it's only a so-called minor rabbinic issue. But the person's engagement in what they'll do in the positive, well, that's got to fall within the expectations of society. Which means the person is always conscious of how's everybody going to view and respond to how I behave. So I'm not going to make a big noise. I'm not necessarily going to do things in a public fashion. I'll do what I have to do, but I'll keep it low key because I don't want to rock the boat. So what causes that? Is that a person's sense, because remember, midos are subjective responses to the world. So this person's subjective response to the world is, the world has to be considered. And I don't necessarily have a voice loud enough to shout down the world, so let me keep to my own space and be a good Jew in my space. So that is in Zayin Midas. That's an issue of Mitzrayim with regards to how the person feels about the world. Right? Feeling and considering and being really concerned with what's out there and how they're going to relate to me. Now, let's say a person's really progressed even beyond that, where they no longer have any concern for what everybody else expects. I'm going to do what the Eibishter wants because that's what the Eibishter wants, and I don't really mind if people think or feel that there's something odd about my behavior. But it's still possible that a person could go out there and do things which are really impressive to everybody else around them, but they're still very much locked into their own personality. Which means the person is doing things that are impressive to the rest of us, but actually in their own head, they're very much stuck in their particular way of thinking, their particular perspective on the world, and they can't challenge that, and there's a certain apathy that is associated with that. This, I know what I'm doing and I'm good, and please don't rock my boat because I'm actually in control. So as far as Rabbi Eliezer is concerned, the highest, most challenging area where we really have to break free of ourselves is in the avodah from Mesiras Nefesh, Chochma shebenefesh, that even in those areas of our lives where we experience Mesiras Nefesh, we have to challenge ourselves to escape our pre-existing state of Mesiras Nefesh. That means you're talking about somebody who really does dedicate to the Eibishter in a way that's completely beyond the restrictions of the rational mind, but still within a particular framework. Now, that's difficult for us to imagine. The Rebbe will give an example It's a fairly well-known example. The Rebbe hat erzählt wegen einem, was hat beim Leinen Krishma Marich gewinnt in Echad. Story about an individual that the Frierdiker Rebbe shares. Here you'll notice the Rebbe does not tell us which kind of an individual. I believe the original story does. And he said that he would meditate on the word Echad and Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, sich Mizbeinen gewinnt in Echad, und hat später gesagt, dass die Zbeines hatte sich gezogen bald eine Minute. So he was very happy to share afterwards that he had successfully focused and meditated on Hashem Echad for a full minute. That means to say, here's somebody who is completely engrossed in the consideration of Echad, which includes the responsibility to sacrifice everything for the Eibishter Mesiras Nefesh. Und Boba Shah hatte gucken auf Azeg und rausrechnen die Zeit, was gestanden in der Knur von Mesiras Nefesh. And while he was genuinely in a state of readiness for Mesiras Nefesh, he also had the presence of mind to check the clock and see how long he had dedicated to the exercise. Or the Bedakus Yoser, or in a much more subtle way. By Misnach, Dod the Hegash as Prophet Mesiras Nefesh. You get some people who they are willing to sacrifice, to experience Mesiras Nefesh for Hashem, and they're very conscious of the fact that I have Mesiras Nefesh, I'm a Mesiras Nefesh Yid. As das Rabbi is, as es noch nicht legamra raus von dem Medidas Vagbolos von seinem Metzius, which of course is clear evidence that the person has not completely escaped themselves. And that would be Rabbi Eliezer's challenge to us, that even our Mesiras Nefesh, we have to challenge whether or not it's real Mesiras Nefesh. Rabbi Akiva goes even beyond that. If them tutu for Rabbi Akiva as kol makah chulish shechomesh makos. Rabbi Akiva says, no, there's a fifth dimension too. Rabbi Eliezer is al shem Ke'avi be'ezri. To understand the difference between Rabbi Eliezer's and Rabbi Akiva's perspectives, let's understand who the people were and what their reality was. Rabbi Eliezer comes from how does he get his name? The Eibishter's on his side. As given Ben Hurkenes, he came from a good family, wealthy, prestigious family. And he's a descendant of Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, which means he could call on the embedded strength of the forefathers to be able to succeed. Was der Fall, als sich bei ihm nicht abgelegt, als etwas kann anrühren dem Ätzem von Aiden. Therefore, in Rabbi Eliezer's world, you have so much support, you have so much holding you, it couldn't enter his mind the possibility that a person could be challenged at the essence of their being as a Jew. Because from his perspective, even if a person doesn't have Voeira, they are still absolutely loyal to Hashem at that time, deep within. Rabbi Akiva has a different background, experience, and perspective. Rabbi Akiva hat gestammt von Gerim. Rabbi Akiva came from a family that is not originally Jewish. Hat gerettet bavonti welche man darf versprechen tachskan verschrina. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva could relate to people who are not even in the system. They're not even in the world of Yiddishkeit. You've got to reel them in. But Dakus Yoser, die Avodah von Mikfir Michidasi, die Avodah zum Attacken sein dem Etzem HaNefesh, or in a much more developed or subtle way, Rabbi Akiva could relate to what David HaMelech calls Mikfirim Yechidasi, my Yechida Shebenefesh, as a challenge from the so-called Kfirim, the young lions, which the Alter Rebbe explains means that just as there is a Yechida Shebenefesh, which is of course the most powerful part of our neshama, it is possible for a person to have the so-called equivalent of a Yechida side of the Nefesh HaBahamis. Just like our Yechida Shebenefesh has an unstoppable force of connection to Hashem, it is possible sometimes that a person has such an overpowering force of the Nefesh HaBahamis they don't know how to control it. And that's who Rabbi Akiva is talking to. You've got to dig to the very depths of your being to be able to break out of the so-called Yechida of the Nefesh HaBahamis, which fights against the person's Yechida. But Rabbi Akiva's approach, which might seem quite jarring to us, that there's work to be done in the Yechida domain, brings to a massive benefit on the other hand. Well, if you do work in this way, that means you can even break out in the radical way of Yetzias Mitzrayim from a level associated with the essence of the Neshama, which is quite a thought. It's possible with Rabbi Akiva's approach to even break free of the limitations of the essence of our neshama, which you would never imagine to have limitations. By connecting to the nefesh elikis that has absolutely no restrictions at all. And das bringt zu Yetzias Mitzrayim in alle Darges, oder Gomra zu Yetzias Mitzrayim from Mitzrayim, the God is there Achem Begashmas, Kemetzeis, Chameretz Mitzrayim, and their floors. If we follow this path, we break out of every kind of imaginable Mitzrayim, including the Goddess that we are in now, with the coming of Mashiach, which should happen immediately.